Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Switzer from the Centre for Independent Studies. Now, will 2021 be a transformational year for tackling climate change? In November, the next United Nations climate negotiations, known as COP26, they'll be held in Glasgow. According to the conventional wisdom, this marks the critical moment when nations will agree to what had been postponed at the Paris climate negotiations in 2015. That is, the rulebook for genuine climate mitigation for the international community. Not just for the developed world like Britain, the United States and Australia, but also the non-OECD world that accounts for nearly 65% of global emissions. How will Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's hosting this conference, how will he help persuade the rest of the world to slash their carbon footprint? Well, let's turn to our panel. Rupert Darwall is Senior Fellow at the Real Clear Foundation, a regular contributor to the Spectator, National Review and the Wall Street Journal. Rupert is author of several books, including The Age of Global Warming, A History. Rupert joins us from London. Hi there, Rupert.
Good to be with you.
And Erwin Jackson is Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change. Some of the recent IGCC reports include Confusion to Clarity, a plan for mandatory task force on climate-related financial disclosure in Australia, and Empowering Communities, how investors can support an equitable transition to net zero. Erwin is based in Melbourne. G'day, Erwin.
Hi, Tom.
Okay, well, let's start with the 2021 UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, it showed that, among other things, global temperatures will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the 2030s, a decade earlier than previously anticipated. It also concludes that climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of natural disasters. Rupert, does this report, as many of the media stories have pointed out, does that reaffirm the imperative to decarbonise the global economy within a few decades?
I think what it does, I think the second part of what you said about the IPCC report is more interesting than the first part, because the headlines were, we're going to breach 1.5 by 2040, just seems, it seemed, I've briefly read the SPM, and it's the language is very, very nuanced, and to reach 1.5 implies almost doubling the decadal rate of increase. It's been just over a tenth of a degree centigrade per decade, and it implies it goes up to 0.2 to 2/10 of a degree. But I think what it says about severe weather events and also about attribution is new. There is quite a lot of controversy about that. Roger Pielke, who is the expert on this, sitting in Boulder, Colorado, has put out a number of tweets on this. One of them was saying there are 54 papers that the IPCC could have cited on weather attribution. 53 said you can't do it. One said you can. And the only paper they cited was that one. So I think there'd be quite a discussion about that. To your question, does this mean net zero? I think it increases the case for adaptation to climate change, because we've had policies of mitigation. Carbon dioxide emissions cuts have been on the table essentially since Kyoto, at least since 1997, and all that has happened is global emissions have continued to rise. And what we've seen, and I'm sure we'll come on to this later, is that the emissions from the West have been broadly flat and more recently have declined, but the emissions from the rest of the world have just risen and risen. So if there is a case for action, it's a case for adaptation rather than net zero.
Okay, now following on from Rupert, Erwin, this of course is the sixth IPCC report in 30 years, and it says the effects of human-induced global warming may be irreversible for centuries. Does this show that the renewable energy policies have failed to halt or slow the relentless rise of carbon emissions?
No, because this report really looks at, as Rupert was talking about, the physical risks of climate change. What it's talking about is if we take various actions, and the report outlines a number of scenarios, under which governments could act or different technological changes could occur, which would deliver different degrees of global temperature increase. But I think going to the heart of your question is, have the renewable and the climate policies that we've undertaken around the world failed over the last 30 years? In one sense, yes, they have. They haven't put us on a trajectory. Like, this is not the first time. The IPCC has warned about these kinds of things. This is, I was involved in the one in 1995. They've been warning about these things for a long time. So from the point of view of failure to act in response to the science, then yes. But I think the thing to remember is that as we've developed the international process through Kyoto, through Copenhagen, the various iterations that happened up until Paris and now in the regime we're in now, every forward projection that we have at those international meetings is lowering. So the base case of what we expect in global warming is lowering. So in Copenhagen, it was around 4 degrees based on current policies. As we went into Paris, it's around 3 degrees. And as countries are announcing new policies and new targets, and it's getting down towards 2 degrees, which just demonstrates that collective action can potentially work as long as governments are implementing policies to back up their targets.
Rupert, if you look at the original IPCC report, I think it was in 1992, the language was pretty guarded. The warnings were relatively modest. They said, for example, they thought that episodes of high temperatures would become more frequent, but they couldn't be sure. This time, though, the language is not so guarded. They say it's unequivocal that human influences warm the atmosphere, ocean and land. Widespread and radical changes in the atmosphere, ocean, biosphere have occurred. Human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. So given that the IPCC has changed its language so dramatically in the course of the last 20 to 30 years, does that give you thought that perhaps we can't adapt, that we need to mitigate against climate change? Rupert?
Yeah, every generation of IPCC report has increased the language around that. I still think, as I briefly read it, there's a very interesting chart looking at what the observed temperature and the simulated temperatures. And the one thing that the computer models still don't get is they don't capture the early 20th century warming. And that's no small matter, because there's still the question of what is the amount of natural internal variability, and the IPCC just basically guesses it. It says it's from memory, it's plus 0.2, it's minus 0.2. So there's a fudge factor there. The other fudge factor, which is always in play, which I noticed when I first sort of got into this, is the role of aerosols, because there was a cooling from about 1944, which is due to aerosols, but of course there's no data on these aerosols because they've gone, they weren't measured then. So I think the expressions of certainty have to be, when you dig a bit deeper, there is always uncertainty about that. But is that a reason not to do anything? I think the case for adaptation is strong, both because of the uncertainty and also because of the continuation of the trend in rising CO2 emissions. And interestingly, coming back to Erwin's point, when you graph this stuff out, and if you look at global CO2 emissions, take out the West's emissions, what you see is a marked acceleration from around 2002. There's a great uptick. If you want to look at Hong Kong, there's a great uptick. And that is associated with a huge industrialization, particularly in China.
Okay, so let's just clarify Rupert's argument here, because his position is that policymakers should build up wealth that will allow for adaptation and amelioration if the worst happens. Erwin, if indeed the effects of human-induced global warming are irreversible, as the IPCC says this week, and it's irreversible for centuries, surely we have no choice but to adapt to a warmer world. Erwin?
Well, we have no choice to adapt to a warmer world. We have the climate change that we're seeing at the moment has been locked in for a number of years. And the emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere will continue to lock in a certain level of future climate change. And that's why I think some of the government's measures that they've currently undertaken on this have been really, really positive. They're looking at building up data so investors, both public and private, can assess which infrastructure is at risk, et cetera. So the government is actually doing some really good work on helping investors invest in adaptation measures, because at the end of the day, the government's not going to be able to pay for all of this. It needs private sector investment. But I think the other thing that's really important here is that if you think about this from an investor's point of view and how they think about this in practice, they basically look at 2 or 3 worlds. One is where climate change is unchecked, one where we go towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, and one where we delay action and then go to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And under their own internal analysis, and all the analysis has been done from the central banks and others, show that the best scenario there is the 1.5 degree scenario. It's the one that delivers the best returns in the long term for beneficiaries.
Okay, and that's precisely why great efforts are underway to decarbonise the global economy. It's not just Western political leaders that are pledging commitments to net zero emissions by 2050 or shortly thereafter. If you look at corporations, they're also investing in a green energy future. You just look at the trends, oil and gas companies, they're losing shareholder battles to climate activists. Financial institutions are divesting their managed funds from corporations invested in fossil fuels. Just this month, in August of 2021, Exxon says it will consider pledging net zero emissions by 2050. So there are clear trends here. Rupert, back to you. Does all this pressure from investors to take a more assertive approach to slashing emissions, does that suggest that fossil fuels are on borrowed time? Rupert.
I think what one can call the greening of Wall Street is a very important development, and you can't deny it's important. Can't deny it's happening. There is colossal pressure from investors on corporations to align their businesses with net zero. I think that's unquestionably the case. Will this force fossil fuels out of business? No, it won't, because what will happen is that the ownership of the producers of fossil fuels, either they're state-owned oil companies, which is vastly the case with petroleum, or it goes to private equity or to owners who are less vulnerable to that kind of pressure. And very interestingly, one of President Obama's climate advisors, Jason Bordoff, wrote a very important article in Foreign Policy, I think it was in June, basically saying this could have unintended consequences. The basically setting up a kind of, if you like, a capital blockade could have unintended consequences by shifting ownership and control to less favorable players in the world. And the other point is, this is no substitute for capping demand. If demand remains there, someone's going to supply it, and all you're doing is you're shifting as I say, ownership of supply. See, there is no substitute for acting on demand if that's what you're trying to do.
Rupert's not alone here, Erwin. Professor Daniel Yergin, one of the world's most distinguished experts on energy policy, he says in a book published a few months ago that the shift to a net zero emissions world, quote, is likely to take longer, to be more expensive, and to require more technical innovation than many now anticipate. And he makes the point that, the world still depends on fossil fuels. Something like 80% of energy use is dedicated to fossil fuels, oil, gas and coal. And his other point is that in the 2020s, government budgets promoting the energy transition will be constrained by the heavy debt burden accumulated in the wake of the coronavirus crisis. So given all of that and what Rupert just said, why are you so confident still that capital markets will continue to put pressure on any companies investing in fossil fuels? Erwin.
Well, the first thing to say is it's actually not just about fossil fuels. In the investors that I represent are universal investors, a lot of them. So that means they're not just invested in fossil fuels, they're invested in insurance, banking, retail, food, fibre, everything across the entire economy. And the reason I say that is that's really important in terms of how investors think about this issue. So what they're doing, when you hear an article about that, they'll say, okay, well, that's one scenario where this could be delayed. Whereas they'll look at another scenario and says, okay, based on past experience with renewables, the costs are going to come down really quickly, so it could happen more quickly. So they're trying to manage that risk. And that's essentially what they're trying to do. And in the managing of that risk, the assessments that they're taking is in terms of delivering long-term returns to their beneficiaries. So in 2050, The best scenario is a net zero one by 2050. And that's what's driving a lot of this behavior. It's not just about fossil fuels, it's about how to protect your entire portfolio from the physical impacts of climate change, but also the transition risks associated with climate change.
And Rupert, this is precisely why many economists are more concerned at Australia being sanctioned by financial markets, investors, lenders, than being hit with European carbon tariffs if the Australian government does not embrace a net zero emissions target by 2050. Rupert?
I think there are two things there. One is carbon tariffs or carbon border adjustments, and the EU looks very clear that it's going to go down that route. And the EU has special reasons to do that because the European Commission wants to have its own source of revenue, and hey presto, carbon border tariffs are one way of doing it. So I think that is something that it will be coming. As for the pressure on capital markets, I was in a debate actually with the governor of Alaska, and Alaska has many of the same issues that Australia is likely to have, which is basically being boycotted by Wall Street. And I think they were auctioning off some oil leases or natural gas leases, and the state ended up doing it itself. Because basically Wall Street wouldn't participate, wouldn't finance them. So yes, I think this is something that this is a real development, and it will require quite a lot of. There will have to be some kind of quite innovative responses to that. The alternative, of course, is to rely on Chinese capital, which is where you don't want to go.
But let's just stick with the fossil fuel argument here, Erwin, because you have said, and you've written a lot about this for your outlet, the investor group on climate change, that the world's financial systems are adapting to net zero, and you say that Australia's current lack of a strong 2030 target and concrete commitment to net zero by 2050, that puts us at a disadvantage in global capital markets. I think that's emerging as a conventional wisdom. So you've actually had a bit of a policy success here, Erwin. But let me push back and put this to you. Australia still holds the biggest reserves of high-quality coal and gas. And as the Federal Labor Resources spokeswoman, Madeleine King, she's made clear Australia will export coal beyond 2050. So I'll put this back to you again. Do fossil fuels still have a long shelf life? Erwin?
Well, I'm not going to predict the future, so all I'm going to say is how investors think about it, and how investors think about it, and how global capital markets are increasingly thinking about it, and the answer is no. But that doesn't mean that we go from today to zero fossil fuels tomorrow. What we're talking about is different pathways for different parts of the fossil fuel system. So obviously, thermal coal will be transitioning out first. Gas will probably go not long after, and then metallurgical coal. So that's why it's important that we have the transition plans in place, because that's how. And the other thing that's really which goes back to a sort of like your first question too: have the renewable energy policies of the world failed? Like, if they've done anything, they've made it the cheapest source of new power in the world in most markets at the moment, and therefore the economics are really deciding where that is going.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the whole process of an energy transition, because many economists believe that we need a carbon price to make that energy transition more plausible. Rupert, as you well know, having followed the Australian debates on climate change, it's been a fraught issue politically in Canberra for more than a decade. Kevin Rudd was defeated or brought down in part because he ditched the emissions trading scheme as soon as the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, put pressure to him. Julia Gillard implemented a carbon tax, but at the subsequent election, Tony Abbott won a landslide. In part, it was a repudiation of the carbon tax, and he subsequently repealed it. And then in 2019, so there have been various efforts to try to have a carbon price, whether it be a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. Many climate activists say that Australia's failure to embrace a carbon price suggests that Australia is a climate outlier. Fair point?
William Nordhaus, who's probably the world's most eminent climate economist, did a presentation to the European Central Bank back in October. And one of the slides he put up showed that show that 80% of carbon dioxide emissions, global carbon dioxide emissions, have zero price on them. So it's a bit kind of, when you say Australia is an outlier, Australia's will be in the 80% rather than the 20%. And when you look at the rest of the world, the carbon price is pretty fragmented and is pretty low as well. So I think you need to look below the headlines to see what's really happening.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is obviously not intent on implementing a carbon price, Erwin. And he says, because he's obviously on the back foot in the wake of this IPCC report, he's gone on the front foot, just reminding everyone that Australia's emissions have fallen by 20% since 2005. We're reducing carbon output faster, according to the Prime Minister, faster than Canada, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, the US, and the OECD average. Now, add to this that Australia has the highest household solar in the world. I think it's something like 1 in 4, and the highest total renewable watts per capita outside of the EU. Australia sounds like it's doing pretty well compared to the rest of the world on climate mitigation, Erwin.
Well, I've been through a lot of UN target setting processes, and every country in the world puts up an explanation about how good its target is to everyone else. And the reality doesn't necessarily meet the facts. So we did an assessment of it, and what we found is that both Australia and New Zealand, with their current targets, risk, in terms of the ambition of their target, falling well behind the OECD average in terms of what our peers would do. But I think the core issue is not so much that. The core issue is that with the targets that countries are announcing are coming ambitious policies. So, for example, we've just seen Japan outline its new energy plan, which has 40% of its generation coming from renewables. So that's what investors are really looking for. So we're in a global market where Australian investors, global investors are looking for good, clean energy projects, which give good long-term returns. They're looking to countries at a macro level. Do you have a net zero target by 2050? Do you have a strong 2030 target? And then they go from there. So it's about actually getting those broad policy signals in place so we can actually compete with those other projects internationally.
And Rupert, Erwin also says that major trading nations that support zero emissions by 2050 represent 70% of Australia's export market. And as a result, they'll target nations such as Australia that don't price carbon or don't commit to net zero emissions. To the extent that Erwin's right, to what extent should Australia be worried? Rupert?
Well, I think when you talk about net zero targets, I mean, Britain, for example, has legislated a net zero target. It's written into law. It has not legislated the means to achieve that. And the means don't exist. I mean, unless you're talking about major, huge changes in lifestyle, which I don't think in a democracy are going to happen. And today's newspaper, today's Times, has a report that Boris Johnson has postponed the banning of gas boilers because he was expecting to have households pay £10,000 to put in heat pumps, which are more expensive to run and heat the home less efficiently. And the reality is biting. And where I do disagree with Erwin is about the economics of renewable energy. I mean, the data for wind from the UK, when you actually look at the accounting data of these projects, there has been very little, if any, decrease in the costs of this stuff. Plus, you've got the huge cost of intermittency. Huge cost, where basically you have to double up on the capital. You need basically two generating systems. One is the wind turbines. The other is the dispatchable, and that is hugely inefficient. It's and economically it's kind of nuts. And what we've had with the electricity market in Britain, what you have when you have renewables, basically you have wholesale prices trending down to zero, which means no one can invest in dispatchable. So you've got a big question mark. How do we keep the lights on? And we haven't solved in Britain. I can tell you that problem is not solved. And I don't think it's been solved anywhere.
So Rupert says that renewables are, all things considered, expensive, requiring a larger taxpayer subsidy, and they're inefficient. Erwin, your response?
I think, again, looking at it from an investor's point of view, if you look at the basic economics, even with storage, for new generation capacity in most parts of the world, it is more economically beneficial to invest in renewables. And I think the other important point here is that, investors don't necessarily, we're talking about, managing billions of dollars a day. They're not necessarily going to get into the weeds of things. So what they do is rely on credible international assessments, such as the International Energy Agency, which just put out a report saying we couldn't get there. We can get to net zero by 2050. But going to Rupert's point, this is always going to be hard. No one ever said this was ever going to be easy. The question is, if you don't start, then you never learn the lessons, you never improve, and you actually don't get moving in the direction that we need to go to. Australia has such a huge opportunity for economic investment here, and the sooner we get moving, the sooner we're going to attract it.
Okay, let's talk about China. Let's cheer ourselves up. President Xi Jinping has announced that China would set a target of reaching net zero emissions by 2060. But I think it's important to recognise that China accounts for nearly a third of global emissions from approving those coal-fired power plants, supporting fossil fuel projects through its signature Belt and Road Initiative. This is the Global Infrastructure Initiative. Let me run a few things by you both. According to Global Energy Monitor, it's a group that monitors fossil fuel trends, a big increase in coal-fired power stations opening in China last year offset all the closures in the rest of the world. According to the research group Rhodium Group, China's carbon emissions in 2019 surpassed those of the US and the developed world combined. Erwin, given all of this, and at a time of an intensifying strategic and economic competition between China and the US, can President Biden, and indeed Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's been very critical of China in other aspects, can they really help persuade China to slash its carbon footprint? Erwin.
Well, let's start off with a few basic facts. Like, China's increase in emissions was exponential from around the early 2000s, but it has actually flattened, and recognising that there's been a recent increase. So the actions that they've taken have had an impact, and the emissions that they've got now are much lower than we expected many years ago. That said, the big test for China will be what it does on coal in terms of its next iteration, where we've set it's got the broad targets. It's got to come forward by Glasgow with its new 2030 target and increase ambition, just like everyone else. And then the real test of that and the accountability will be around how they're doing with coal. There's probably two examples and points that are probably useful in terms of observations about this. One is that recent Belt and Road Initiative spending on coal plants from China has plummeted. And indeed, in the first 6 months of the year, it's the first 6 months we've seen no investment in coal plants under the Belt and Road Initiative.
How do you account for the point that China's reducing its initiatives in
I think I think the broader point here about China, probably actually, before I jump into the weeds and that stuff, is just like every other world leader and every other country, they're starting to see where the new economic opportunities of the future are. They want to dominate that market. So therefore, it is ultimately in their interest to actually be and undertake active roles to promote new clean energy technology and clean steel and green hydrogen, et cetera, in their own country. And I think this is a meta trend that we've seen amongst countries in the last few years, where they're all sort of on board. So in some respects, the diplomacy that we're talking about in the question you asked becomes less relevant because it supports the economic activity as opposed to the economic activity supporting the other way around, as we've had in the past. So I think that we're starting to get into this vicious cycle, and China's going to want to play in that game. How far and how strong the commitments we can get from China by the end of the year, we'll have to wait and see.
But without a binding, verifiable and enforceable mechanism, pledges by China are just that, nothing more. And Rupert, to complicate things further, both the US and the UK are now among China's most ferocious critics, calling out Beijing over its treatment of the Muslim minority, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the criticism of China's treatment of democracy campaigners in Hong Kong, Beijing's aggressive stance towards Taiwan, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, all that. So given that, how will Joe Biden and Boris Johnson help persuade China to slash its carbon footprint? Rupert?
I don't think it's plausible at all to think any pressure from the West is going to alter what China does. I mean, I think, but I think if you step back and look at this kind of put the UN climate talks into context, they began the Rio was 1992. It was just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and if you like, geopolitics took a holiday for a couple of decades. What we're seeing now with President Xi is geopolitics coming back. People, and this has been a huge change in Washington, is the breaking of the consensus about China, that having China in the WTO will lead to will help liberalize China, etc., etc. No one believes that anymore, and we're back more into a world of geostrategic competition, and I think that fundamentally alters the dynamics of climate change. The other thing to bear in mind is a consistent theme in the UN climate talks has been the refusal of countries like China, indeed the developing world, to be bound by multilateral emissions cuts. And the only reason why Paris came about was because its architecture was about nationally determined contributions. And I wrote a piece the other day saying this was, if you remember with Gorbachev towards the end of the Cold War, he talked about the Sinatra doctrine of the Soviet satellites being able to go their own way, and they did. The Paris Agreement was the Sinatra doctrine of climate change. It basically lets every nation go its own way.
There may be a lot of truth to that, but one can acknowledge that and still recognise that, correct me if I'm wrong, Rupert, China is leading the world on clean technology. And aren't they doing that in part to address pressing local environmental concerns? Rupert?
Yeah, when President Xi became General Secretary, he made a speech saying Chinese wanted cleaner cities. And Mike Bloomberg sort of picked that up, and he said, well, they're building coal-fired power stations outside major cities. But of course, that doesn't reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So I think you need to differentiate between local air pollution and CO2, which is not a local pollutant. It's only a pollutant on a global scale.
Well, China's emissions are steadily escalating, and Rupert makes the point that the Chinese leadership is hell-bent on increasing carbon emissions to grow its economy and reduce poverty. And frankly, that's probably the position of most leaders of the non-OECD world. Erwin, doesn't China have an interest then in still promoting coal production across the world in supporting those Belt and Road initiatives as we come out of the pandemic?
You know, I'd actually challenge the assumption that most people in the OECD see their future this way. I think we have seen very ambitious policies from India on renewable energy and looking at diversifying their energy system. We now have active conversations between the Asian Development Bank and some of the world's biggest financial institutions like BlackRock and Prudential, HSBC, about how we can actually create a blended financing mechanism to actually shut down coal plants in Asia before they come to their economic life. So there is a lot of movement in Asian countries in particular on these issues. And indeed, the Indonesian finance minister has highlighted that it's actually really become really difficult for them to get financing for coal projects for the same reason it's become difficult to get financing for coal projects everywhere in the world. Now, in terms of what China does and what other nations do, like Japan and South Korea, in terms of exporting coal technologies and so forth, that's something that will have to be addressed. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative will be continually scrutinised. But at the end of the day, it's fundamentally in China's long-term interest to have this problem solved. Like, it by itself cannot fix the problem, but it by itself can also not adapt to the problem.
And on India is the third largest emitter in the world. Rupert, doesn't the fact that India is heavily investing in solar energy indicate that they're prepared to sign up to a more legally binding and verifiable and enforceable agreement at Glasgow? Rupert?
India, from memory, I think India's per capita electricity consumption is about 1/5 that of China's. And you could argue that the biggest loser from the Paris Agreement was India, because it is is so far behind China in terms of industrialization and indeed in terms of per capita income and so forth. And because renewables, I mean, we've just had this discussion. Because renewables have inherent problems of intermittency, and they, as a result, cost more. Going down a green route will cost India a huge amount in terms of its development. How it addresses that, Tom, I don't know. I mean, how to the extent to which it buys the, if you like, the renewable myth, I don't know, but it will cause it real developmental problems, because the biggest, if you look back, the biggest shift from the 19th century to the 20th century was having electricity, electrifying businesses and households. And that's what Indians need, and indeed Africans need, is reliable, affordable electricity. When you flick a switch, it's there. And absent that, they will be locked into underdevelopment.
Erwin.
Well, we could debate the reality is the global capital markets, the world's biggest energy analysts have all said we can get to net zero by 2050. It requires government policy. It requires investor engagement. It requires government action. It's just, the reality is in most parts of the world, and most of the independent analysis that my members would look at, it is cheaper to invest in renewables with storage to deal with the intermittency issues that Rupert is talking about it than it is to invest in a new coal plant.
Okay, well, let's move to the political leaders at Glasgow, because they're gathering in November. It's widely seen as a climate change game changer. Now, COP26 will ask not just for target dates for zero carbon emissions, it'll demand that nations set out their plans for how they achieve them. Rupert, Copenhagen was a comprehensive failure in 2009, but there was the Kyoto Agreement in 1997. There was a Paris Agreement in 2015. What are the prospects of a binding, enforceable and verifiable agreement at Glasgow later this year? Rupert.
The point about Paris is that there is no need, in a sense, there's no need for to have these COPs anymore, except for you mentioned rule books and interpreting data and so forth. But the architecture of the Paris Agreement is built around nationally determined contributions. So basically, you can just post your NDC in, and that's done. So I think it was a big mistake to hype up COP26 as a major event, because actually it isn't a major event. The events take place in national capitals of individual governments saying what they're going to do with their next 5-year plan.
But many nations have enshrined their targets in domestic law. But Erwin, is there an international forum to hold them accountable?
Well, yes, there is. And that's exactly the process we're going through at the moment. Like the entire Paris Agreement is built around, as Rupert is saying, nationally determined contributions.
But sorry, it's not legally binding, enforceable and verifiable.
No, it is binding because you have to have one. It's also verifiable because you have the measurement, reporting and verifiable system that actually is built into the agreement. And it's also different from just a bottom-down, bottom-up agreement, because it also creates accountabilities around what countries are expected to do. So, for example, when a country puts forward its NDC, it needs to demonstrate how that target is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, most countries have done that in various ways, in which I talked about earlier about countries cooking the books. Australia's never done that. It's never shown how its target is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And I think the other critical point here is while these meetings happen, they impact on capital markets. Paris sent a clear long-term signal to capital markets that net zero emissions is the destination over the long term. How we get there in a good way or a bad way, that's the destination. And when the global discussion now has moved from a conversation about how we limit warming to 2 degrees to how we limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and capital markets hear that, and now they're factoring that into the decisions that they're making.
Rupert, your response, and also to the claim that Paris is indeed legally binding, verifiable and enforceable.
Erwin's correct that the two bits of Paris that are legally binding are you will submit 5-yearly nationally determined contributions, and each subsequent one will be an improvement on the previous one. Those are basically the two elements, and the rest is just kind of flim-flam. as for Paris sending a signal to capital markets, very clear. We need to be clear what's actually in the Paris Agreement. What it said was it basically set a 2-degree target, and it said pursue best efforts to limit to 1.5. So it's just best efforts. And when you've got 2 targets, you know that the second one is actually less important than the first one. It also outlined a trajectory to reach that target, which was reaching, I think it was a balance between anthropogenic emissions and sinks, sources and sinks, and it was in the second half of the 21st century. It was not 2050. What subsequently happened was the IPCC came along and interpreted that and did various calculations, and there's quite a lot of smoke and mirrors those calculations, said, hey presto, it's net zero by 2050. That what the IPCC says has no legal standing whatsoever. And as I say, it's completely smoke and mirrors stuff. They repackaged the 1.5 degree budget because the previous one had expired, which they're going to have to do again. I guess they're going to do that again at some point.
Okay, this is a very lively discussion, but we will take questions from our members. First question from Tristan in Brisbane. He says that nuclear energy could help uranium-rich Australia reach net emissions faster than renewables. Much of the G20 uses nuclear energy, Tristan says. Question, do you think nuclear energy should be part of Australia's climate mitigation policy? First to you, Erwin.
Well, IGCC doesn't do technology beauty pageants, but I think I think the core issue here is that Australia has vast amounts of resources that will benefit us in a world that transitions to net zero emissions. We have lithium, we have copper, we have a wealth of mineral resources that we can export to the world to support this transition. So while a lot of the conversation is about attacking the fossil fuel industry and so forth, this is not about attacking the resources industry, because we need a strong resources industry in Australia. But I think the other important point here is, regardless of the technology, it all really comes back to, as I said earlier, capital is global. It's looking for the best investment opportunities. It's looking for them at scale, like billions of dollar scale. You've got to have the policy frameworks in place to support that.
Given that it accounts for something like 5% of global energy, 5% or thereabouts, if you add hydropower, it's another 5%, and then the other 5% is 15%, and then you've got about 80 to 85% that's fossil fuels. Nuclear energy, Rupert.
Well, what's interesting about nuclear is that some of the greenest places in the world, which are allegedly most concerned about climate change, have been exiting nuclear power. Foremost amongst those is Germany, where actually the Greens came into existence in opposition to nuclear power. You've had nuclear power stations being closed in California and New York. Belgium, I think, is closing its nuclear power station when he ran for president. Emmanuel Macron did a deal with the Greens to cap the amount of nuclear power. So I think the environmentalists are completely conflicted on nuclear, and yes, of course, nuclear should be part of the mix. It's incredible. It's not considered. I mean, it is the sole source, other than hydro, of zero emission dispatchable electricity.
Question, Jenny from Brisbane, looking at the United States, that innovation in developing low-cost natural gas may have done more than any government policy to reduce emissions in the past decade. That's in the United States. Erwin, the fracking revolution, shale gas, is that a way forward in terms of reducing emissions?
Well, I think the way that the investors are now thinking about gas is, in the past, like 18 months ago, and this has happened really rapidly, just to illustrate how fast things are happening in global capital markets. In the past, a gas project would have been considered, well, of course we're going to invest in it. Now the question that investors are asking is, okay, well, why should we invest in it? And they're essentially looking at scenarios going forward where the demand for the product is declining, and the competition for the product is increasing through renewables. And they're also looking at uncertainty, in Australia's case, from domestic policy. So when an international investor wants to invest in an Australian oil and gas industry, if it went to a terminal and said, which company should we invest in, the Australian companies would be at the bottom of the list because of, with the Russian and the Saudi companies, because we don't have a clear climate policy here.
Yeah, and following on the US point, Rupert, my understanding is that President Biden, or certainly many Democrats in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, want to strangle shale fracking revolution or the natural gas with regulations. Now, if fracking helps reduce emissions, why do so many supporters of net zero emissions want to reject the shale gas revolution?
Well, there's a fundamental problem, as Erwin has touched on, is that if you're going to net zero, even if you regard natural gas as a so-called bridging technology, no one's going to put money into a new combined cycle gas turbine power station if it's going to be shuttered in 20 years when it could be generating electricity for 40. So there's a fundamental problem that basically net zero basically kills off investment in otherwise very suitable technologies. I mean that's a basic problem when you're mandating such a rapid energy transition.
Rupert, another question for you. This is from Ben in Canberra. He says that car makers are enjoying increasing electric vehicle sales. So doesn't that suggest the future is with electric cars? Rupert?
Well, the future may well be with electric cars, but at the moment, I can speak for Britain and Europe. They're basically very heavily subsidised, and they're very expensive. I mean, a neighbour had his stolen the other day, and I said, "Why have they stolen it?" And it turned out this vehicle was cost £85,000. I mean, you know that is that's way off most people's budget.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, the counter argument to Erwin is that if electric vehicle sales are increasing so dramatically, particularly in Europe and America, why does the government need to subsidise them?
Well, I think there's, from an institutional investor's point of view, and we're talking about investors who might invest in toll roads or big major infrastructure projects. The difference we would see between Australia and Europe, for example, is that because there is an EV policy and overall strategy within Europe, the investors are actually prepared to take on more cost to actually implement the incremental cost associated with putting charging stations on tollways, for example. But because we don't have a strong EV policy here, that same institutional investor will not look at Australia and therefore not invest in that tollway and upgrade it with EV policies. Because I think the core point with EVs is this is probably going to happen much faster than we think. Most of the auto manufacturers are now looking at phase out dates of the internal combustion engine around 2030, 2035, and Australia needs to be ready for it.
Lydia from Sydney, the science is clear, Rupert. This is what she says, that unless we reach net zero emissions by 2050, there'll be worse floods, more terrible and frequent heat waves and devastating droughts. Surely the lesson of COVID is that the gravest challenges can be met by political leaders who recognise that exceptional times require exceptional measures, yet neither you, Rupert, nor our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, wants to treat climate change in the same way. Rupert?
Well, because what I said, as we discussed earlier, your Prime Minister is not President of China. It's all very well saying what we must do and whatever. Who is we? I mean, this is a global problem, and it is absolutely clear that emissions have gone up irrespective of what the West has done. As I said at the beginning, the West emissions, the last year in which the West's emissions were higher than the rest of the world's emissions was 1981.
Okay, we've got another question here from Tasman Graham in Brisbane, I think. Tasman, great to have you tuning in. And he asks, are Conservative and centre-right parties at risk of losing the next generation almost entirely by being laggards on climate change action when in fact they could be leading the way with market-based mechanisms to actually address the challenge? I think that's a question really for you, Rupert. Because there are many Tories in Britain who will make that argument. Rupert.
There was a very interesting study by a group of, they're kind of consensus supporting economists and climate scientists. And it basically said that you had to be born in 2050 or afterwards to have a net benefit from climate policy. That basically this, when you talk about the younger generation and their children are not going to have any net benefit from climate policy. So what they're saying is we should impose a very substantial cost of living penalty on on current and particularly the young generation. The young generation are going to pay bear the biggest burden from climate change policy. And I'm not sure when that sinks in, perhaps the voting intentions might change.
Do you mind, Tom, if I jump in there quickly?
Yep. So, Erwin.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that's interesting in terms of what we see amongst our members is that in terms of attracting new talent into companies and ESG is really, really important. And what the companies who are setting targets are finding, this is I'm particularly talking about the property market here, where the property industry is setting some really strong net zero targets by 2030, etc. By setting those targets, they're actually building up a level of experience in innovation and a buy-in to the company from their staff. And it's actually invigorating their younger staff members. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here as well as sort of the downsides.
But let me put this back to you, Erwin, and feel free to weigh into this too, Rupert. One of the reasons why climate mitigation has been so difficult around the globe is that it's unpopular with electorates. If you think about the street protests in France a year or so ago, the recent anti-carbon tax referendum in Switzerland. I mentioned Australia's federal elections before, most notably in 2013 when Tony Abbott won a landslide in response to Julia Gillard's carbon tax. Even Boris Johnson's attempt to ban gas boilers in the UK, I think Rupert mentioned this before, that's met a fierce public backlash. So the question here for both of you is, how do political leaders win over the public to embrace these kind of climate mitigation policies that you, Erwin, have been talking about? Erwin, to you first.
Well, it's really hard. Like, I've been involved in climate policy for 30 years and I've got the scars for it. But I think where we are now is in this particular crossroad where we are, where global capital markets are moving faster than we've ever seen, governments moving faster than we've ever seen, corporations moving faster than we've ever seen, that we really need to put aside the politics of division on this issue in this country, because that's effectively what's driving us back. We need to come together, get a plan for net zero and do it in a way that is just and fair for the communities who are going to be impacted by that transition.
Rupert Darwall.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's required is honesty. And Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, who's a great net zero advocate, says, well, he wants companies to be net zero. At the same time, he knows they can't be net zero. And the way they get to net zero is by buying carbon offsets. And that is the dirty secret of a lot of what's going on in the corporate world, is buying carbon offsets. And the other thing with renewable electricity, how does electricity supply be 100% renewable? Because they buy renewable credits. And so, there's a lot of false badging going on about this. And I think that, the first thing that's needed in this debate is about honesty about that.
Okay, let me conclude on this sort of quirky note and be mischievous and put to you both that perhaps you're both right. Could it be that you're both right, but for different reasons? That Erwin, for example, is right that capital markets are investing heavily in a green future, which is why the points I made earlier, as oil and gas companies are losing shareholder battles to climate enthusiasts. Financial institutions are divesting their managed funds from corporations invested in fossil fuels. So you could argue that Erwin is right on that. But Rupert is also right in that the declining emissions of the OECD, countries like America, the countries in the European Union, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, the declining emissions of the developed world are being dwarfed by the increasing emissions by the non-OECD world, and that these nations account for nearly 65% of annual global emissions as they try to grow their economies. So could I put that to both of you, that you're both right? First to you, Erwin.
Well, I was going to put some square brackets before you gravelled it through. But I think that broadly speaking, yes. But I think the only caveat that I would make is that everyone acknowledges that the challenge here is largely about how we manage the transition in the developing world. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I would just disagree that their emissions are ballooning out of control at the moment. That's all.
Rupert, especially if there's a technological breakthrough, Rupert, right? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think technological breakthroughs are great. What we haven't had so far is there isn't a technological breakthrough at the moment. And yeah, of course, if technology innovation, yeah, we're all for that. But the path we're on at the moment, the technology does not exist at the moment to get us to net zero. It can only be done with carbon credits.
Well, look, gentlemen, this has been a lively and thoughtful discussion. I'm grateful to both of you, Erwin and Rupert. CIS very rarely weighs into the climate debates, mainly because we haven't got the scholarship available. We don't have the resources. I think the one major publication that we released was in 2007, and it was by a free market economist making the point that a carbon tax was more effective than an emissions trading scheme or a cap and trade model to reduce emissions. But today, our members have been well blessed by having your company here today. So Erwin in Melbourne, Rupert in London, from all of us at the Centre for Independent Studies, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Well, for decades, CIS has been a proudly independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations so we can advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.